Good afternoon, everyone. Everyone has got a little bit of a sugar high after our nutritional break, I hope. I am so honored to be here with my dear sister friend, Lisa Jackson, who has an opportunity to drop some pearls of wisdom and to tell us about the very important work that she's doing. But we should always begin in gratitude. So I first want to thank everyone who was involved in putting this very important event together. Tony and Sam, thank you so much for bringing us together at this key moment. For every single person, including the folks who stacked the chairs, and we'll pick them back up. That's right. Thank you for everything that you've done. For us, BEA is a family affair. My husband, Broderick, who you met earlier, is on the board, and so we live, breathe, and eat BEA, and now we get to talk BEA.
That's great.
With a very special person. So Lisa, give us, if you don't mind, let's begin with just sort of a look at the landscape right now. Because we live in a moment where issues around diversity, around equity, it's often seen as a side dish issue. And right now it is always on the menu and usually served hot. And so help us understand what that means from a corporate perspective. Is it a moment of opportunity? Is it a moment of repose? Is it a moment of confusion, or maybe a little bit of all of the above?
It's definitely, it's a bit of a moment of testing, right? It is a moment to make you stop and think about what it is, especially those of us of color, those of us who've been working in this field. I'm an environmentalist, so I'm often thinking of things in environmental equity terms. But it makes you stop and say, is the work I'm doing effective? I need to make sure it's not performance. I need to make sure I feel like we're still making progress. And you're doing that all with other people who are characterizing the nature of the work you do without having any understanding of it. So it's a moment of testing. Of course, I work for Apple, and so one of the things that I'm really proud of is that there's sort of two dimensions to this work when we look at it. First, of course, is the internal work of what the workforce looks like, how we encourage it, how do we ensure there's real collaboration and respect and listening and inclusion going on. I don't lead that work at Apple. We have a wonderful woman who does, our VP, Barb Y, for inclusion and diversity. But what I lead at Apple is something called our Racial Equity and Justice Initiative, which started in 2020. We all remember the events of 2020 around George Floyd, so I don't want to go into that part of the origin story, but I want to go into a little slight different one. We wanted that to be, we have work always to do internally, especially in Silicon Valley, but we also don't want to miss the moment to also show up in the communities where we frankly have customers and workers and employees and supply chains, and do something there as well. So this was a $100 million commitment. We're well over $200 million.
You should just say that again, $100 million.
$100 million, but we've doubled that in the 4 years. It'll be 4 years in June and more. We'll probably do another update in June to say where we are. And the idea was to invest in racial equity and justice. We started in the United States. And it was also, I'm looking at turning intentions into impact. I think this is also a moment, at least for us at Apple, to take stock of making sure the places we're most impactful are the things we do best. Like, we didn't go try to find things we don't do. So we focus on education. Why? Because our products have always been a part of revolutionizing the classroom. We focus on economic power. Why? Because we spend a lot of money on suppliers. We buy services, we buy things, we have supply chains. How do we ensure that we are increasing equity when we spend our money? And frankly, because the moment was 2020, we also donate to organizations working on criminal justice reform, not because that is our expertise, but because we acknowledge that our products capture those moments. And so therefore we feel connected to that work.
So 2020 is part of your origin story. I know you don't want to talk about it much, but we know from watching the news, and we know from one of our earlier panelists, that there were a lot of companies that made commitments. in the wake of the killing of George Floyd, almost $200 billion. But not everybody has made good on those commitments. Some people have, it was more of a whiteboard promise. Some people had put money against that, but they didn't make the second or the third installment in that payment. You have worked for a company that has increasingly increased their investment in the wake of 2020. Can you talk a little bit, without giving away company secrets, but about the kind of conversations that allow that to happen? Because that hasn't happened in so many other spaces.
I think sometimes we forget to gather the flowers that are around us. So let me explain what that means in our context. First, I do believe, and I am very proud to work at Apple, because when we say we're going to do something, we do it. We don't make a lot of announcements. We're actually pretty famously a company that doesn't like anyone to know what we're working on until one day we give it to you and hope you really love it and buy it, frankly. I mean, that's what the company is sort of premised on. But what we did, and Alicia Johnson, who runs the program, is here, and was to pull together what people were already doing in the company. We have a huge education business, but we also, ever since President Obama had the Connect Ed program, I don't know if we all remember that, had an educational philanthropy side. And it was based on income. And unfortunately, income and race track pretty closely in many communities, not entirely. And so we could look at that work, and instead of saying, now we're going to do something new, we took that in and said, this is now part of our racial equity and justice initiative as well. Let's put it on steroids. Let's add money to it. We did the same with the environmental work that I first joined Apple to lead. We said, you know what, we work with groups. Why don't we look at the intersection of environmentalism and economic opportunity? Where are the businesses that should be growing up around all this money on renewable energy and battery charging and batteries? Let's incubate those businesses so we can hopefully be one of their customers. They can be in our supply chain, which would make us a customer. And so first what we did was bring together the organization around, hey, this is great work you're doing. Can we talk about it? Alicia and I, and Alicia more than me, must have had hundreds of conversations around Apple, understanding with what primarily were allies were doing. Not all led by people of color, but an initiative focused on people of color. And there was tremendous energy around it because of the time. And so what we've done over time is build on that really significant base. And I think it's a sturdy and a steady one. So I would recommend that sometimes, especially when you're talking about external programming, different from D&I, the classic I&D, you look at what we're already doing under other guises and say, make people feel really good about that, and then say, now let's talk about how we can extend it and build on it and get you some more resources to do this.
Build stakeholders.
Build stakeholders internally, and then go out into the community and make sure you're working with them, not at them.
So whether you're talking about external work or internal work, we're at a moment where many of the stakeholders in this work are feeling anxious for good reason. There's a certain amount of peril around this. They're worried about lawsuits. They're worried about headlines. And they're just exhausted in some cases. So I want to ask about both those things. How do you generate energy around something in a moment of peril where people feel like they're walking through landmines, knowing that the work, even if they're invested, and we should be honest, there are some people who will use this moment to say, this was an eat your peas exercise that I didn't want to do anyway. So now I can just tap out, and we should just be honest that is happening in some spaces. But when there is genuine will, how do you move intention into action when you're walking through a sort of a new set of landmines in the current landscape?
Look, I think part of it is knowing yourself and really being very intentional about what the goal and the mission is here. If the mission was an announcement that made our employees happy back 4 years ago, that's a pretty easy thing to do. I already mentioned we don't do that. We've never done that. But we're so grounded in this work and in being thoughtful about the work that I think it is, I'm not going to say people suddenly walk away. I do think there was self-selection. If you never wanted to eat those peas, you weren't really eating them anyway.
You're
So
moving them off the plate.
you might just be a little more open about it, but you were never really engaged. But the people who were doing the work, the people that we have been doing work, give strength to each other. You feel that as an actual morale boost. And, it came from the top. Tim Cook is our CEO. When we first had the idea to do an initiative around racial equity, which, we were very intentional. We went to him and we said, hey, can we do it? And I'll be frank, other people were just coming out with numbers that would blow you away. We now know they haven't materialized in large part. And he was thoughtful and committed to it. And when he did, he understood that we were going to do it the way I do my environmental work, which is, it is part of the business of the company. Mm-hmm. We talk about Apple's business is to enrich people's lives. We are a multinational company, and it's not just some lives. Mm-hmm. And so we have to make sure that we're showing up in communities in a way that keeps us close to the heart. We're a consumer products company. When you pick up that phone and you see our logo or your computer, we want you to feel good about that. And that means we have to think about that work in the context of all the various people who are our customers. But I know it's hard. Look, I would call it paranoia, but it's not paranoia when it's real. Yeah. It's out there. It's every day in the news. It is being attacked. We could have a discussion, and I know we've had a discussion in this forum, you have, about what to call it and whether, it's worth fighting the fight over the what's it called versus getting it done. I think in our case, because this work was being done and is being expanded, that hasn't come up. Like, should we walk away from this work?
But let me ask you about what it's called, because I wonder if there's anything that you learned in your work around, in your environmental work, that applies to this space now, because the very word diversity has been weaponized. It's hard to, in a corporate setting, let's talk about diversity, and people tense up at this point. So how do you figure out how to do the work, how to create diverse and inclusive and equitable spaces when there are people who are so invested in our division that they've weaponized the very concept of diversity? It sounds like there's things that you have done in the environmental space where something similar happened and you're able to actually do the work but figure out how to rebrand or reframe it and stay on mission.
It's actually so the popular term started 30 years ago in the environmental space was ESG. Has anybody in here? ESG, environment, social governance. It's actually broader than environment, just as you can tell by the title, but it became this rubric by which companies, corporations would be evaluated in addition to their bottom line. How are you doing in environment, though? And how's your governance? And what are you doing socially out in the world? And that became almost a scorecard. And that has also been weaponized as a concept over the last couple of years. From the time I ran the EPA and before, I didn't like the term ESG. I didn't like it because it was some nebulous thing out there that didn't describe in any concrete way what you were actually doing. So when we talk about the environment at Apple, and don't get me started because we don't have time, I can go into chapter and verse on all the things we do. What are our goals? How are we going to get to 2030? We have a whole plan. Where are we in the plan? Tell me the numbers. Tell me how much it costs. Explain to me how that's not hurting the business, but instead helping it. So I don't get caught in this there is something about this convention of, it becomes almost a business around ESG instead of the business of the environment or on community engagement and racial equity. So we didn't call it ESG. We call it Racial Equity and Justice Initiative. We call it the Environmental Initiative. When we work with people with disabilities, we call it our Accessibility Initiatives. So we can pinpoint exactly what we're doing. But I shouldn't, there's some great examples. We've done $100+ million on helping businesses. We've done $50 million to venture capital firms. Collab Capital, I heard Barry is here. There you are. Harlem Capital, Vamos Ventures, because our Racial Equity and Justice Initiative extends to the Hispanic community. We've done work with Siebert Williams Shank, their initiative, their Clear Vision Fund, which lends money to Black founders, and we've done work with C-Note, which lends money to Black and Brown-owned institutions, banking and other financial institutions. That's all business that we do. We have to invest that money. And so it's also thinking of it in business terms, and that helps a lot as well.
So it's not just something that is altruistic. It's good for the bottom line. I mean, there's one thing that I actually wrote about in the book I just published that I think relates a little bit to this, that how you frame something. And this is something that people in the room can use if you feel like it's difficult to talk about diversity. So let's talk about diversity without using the word. Like, let's, it was an exercise that I was asked to go through a long time ago, to talk about poverty without using the word poverty, without using poor, without using impoverished or any of its derivatives. Well, then you have to talk about what it really is. That people who don't have enough to eat, people who are unbanked, people who can't. So if you talk about diversity in that way, it's interesting because it takes the word away, and then you're trying to figure out, okay, what is it when we talk about inclusion, what are we really talking about? And you realize that not everybody has the same view.
That's right.
Not everybody actually is on the same page, but then you're actually talking about your objectives. You're actually talking about your goals, and there's a way to do that without, actually hanging on the word, because DEI can also, or racial equity or inclusion or belonging, which is, one of the words that's been added to that daisy chain.
Yep.
Now can be used as sort of an easy way to say, yes, we have a belonging program.
I think that's absolutely right. Well, first off, let's take a minute on the book you just published, which is Hidden Conversations. I, as you know, have spent time with it both in hardcover and in listening to your beautiful voice as you read it. But if you haven't discovered it, folks, it is an incredibly important way to hear perspectives and to challenge ourselves to do it in a way that at the other end is constructive. Because so many things, and you handle it so beautifully, make you so angry in that book.
Yeah.
But then you have to get past it and allow people to tell their stories. So I also think in corporate America, we can't get by this, that part of turning intentions and hearing into impact is trying to neutralize ourselves to jump to what camp we're going to all sit in. But how did you find that? I mean, you were listening to people tell stories that in many ways pull people into all these boxes.
And in many cases, people I didn't agree with. If you put a basket on the table and say, everyone tell your story, you're going to hear from people. And if it's about race, you're going to hear from people that you don't agree with. The benefit, though, is understanding how steep the hill is. Understanding how you can figure out how to work with someone that you don't agree with. And that was one of the lessons for me in working with our corporate partners or in education, that a lot of people don't know how to have this conversation. They don't know how to do what you're doing in this room. They literally don't know how or where or when to do it. People are, is there going to be a day on Tuesday where everyone comes together and talks about this, and someone else is going to lead the conversation, and I'm just going to watch. I'm not going to participate. There's benefit in allowing people to actually speak their truth, and there's benefit in listening to someone, and it's really hard to do that in a corporate space. It's particularly hard to do that in a corporate space. I want to give the room a chance to hear what works. The biggest space in the world is the room for improvement. And pun intended. And so who's getting it right? And what are the 2 or 3 things that people in the room can take back to their spaces, whether they work in a foundational space or a government space, or whether they're in the private sector, trying to figure out how to use their voice perhaps more in the public sector. A couple of examples of things that you have seen in your travels that really work, and a couple of examples of things that people can take out of the room as action items.
As actionable. The biggest successes we have are when other people tell the story. So that is deep and important work to find people who are who have a plan, who know what it is that they're trying to do, who understand enough of the language of corporate America, I'm only going to speak from the corporate perspective, to be able to reflect it in and out and organize what it is they're trying to do in a way that works, you know, with our goals. I mean, we do some philanthropic work for sure, but the majority of even the educational work we do has a great benefit to us because we love people using our tools and our products and our services. We love that we can show up at the Propel Center in Atlanta and touch kids throughout the HBCU world. We love that we can be at Cal State University Northridge and meet and touch kids throughout the HSI, the Hispanic Serving Institution world. So I think, you know, finding those people and being one of those people who understands how important it is to scale, to meet metrics, to be able to say, this is what I will deliver for either the charity dollars or the investment that you're making in me, and I will help you talk about it. Because it's much harder to attack someone who's out there saying this is great work than it is to call me a ESG greenwasher or something, which is, you know, what you're gonna hear very often. So what works is taking the time to really find meaningful partners, and they need to be of the community and they need to be in the community. The second, though, is maybe the opposite, which is finding those allies, finding the people, you know, you said it earlier, who are going to be in a position to make the decision, the ultimate decision. I am not the CEO, right? But it's not just the CEO, the CFO, finding the arguments that this is good come from being able to speak the language of the company in a way that makes it clear why this is good. Community is incredibly important. So trying to support a community from outside of it, which many of us, you know, are sort of the link between inside and out, if you will, it still doesn't work. I find that what you have to do is have leadership and then empower wonderful people like Dr. Lisa Herring at the Propel Center, who then go out and say, now let me work in this complex world of HBCUs and understand how to make this technology work. And I think it's moments like this where people get together, brilliant people, and build bridges and collaboration and thought and lay your own base of foundation for success.
I love how you use your platforms.
Oh.
I love how you use your voice. And because Lisa's a good friend, I've spent a lot of time with her, I love the way that you give people love taps. And you don't even know that you're doing it, but I've been with you where you are on the phone and you're sending a message and you'll say, I'm sending a note to somebody because I think they need to hear from me.
Oh, thank you.
And I just want to end with that because that's something that everybody in the room can do because exhaustion is real. That's one of the things that I learned on my book tour, is people right now are, racial exhaustion is a real thing. People are tired. And people who do the work, who actually charge up the hill, are particularly tired right now. And so the way that you, so often when I'm with you, you're sending a note, and you'll say, this person needs to hear from me. If we all did that, that can keep this power center, you know, this generator going, you know, to hype each other up in a moment. Not because they did something special, not because it's their birthday, just because someone every so often needs a love tap, and that can really keep them going. I have been the recipient of that. I've woken up at 6 o'clock in the morning. I'm like, and she's on the West Coast. Does she sleep?
Sometimes not.
You know, there was the day that you sent me a note because the sky is orange.
Yeah, oh yeah.
There was that day.
Horrible.
But, you know, just those kind of things. And so we're talking about what we can do, and that is a small action item that every single person in the room can do. And while you're at it, remind everybody to also go vote.
Amen.
All right. Thank you so
y'all.
much.